Baffa, and I'm the Executive Director of Ventura Land Trust. The purpose of the Environmental Speaker Series is to bring members from our community together to learn about the natural world and the people who study it, learn from it, and protect it. This series is offered for free as a benefit to our community, but we do, of course, welcome donations to help support this and other programs offered by Ventura Land Trust. The suggested donation is $10, and you can contribute through the donation box. Do we have the donation box out on the table? No. Okay, so you can contribute by going online to venturalandtrust.org if you are so inclined. I didn't think I saw it. Before we get started with tonight's program, I did want to provide a quick update on the status of our preserves. For Harmon Canyon, parts of Upper Canyon do remain closed due to the major damage that was sustained earlier this year, and will remain so for the foreseeable future, as that work has been turned over to SoCal Edison's Civil Engineering Department. So it's going to take a little while for some of those sections. But we are very excited to report that part of the main road is now open a little bit further than it was before, and that we've opened up the Roper-Smith Family Trail to bi-directional traffic. So if you do decide to use that trail, please remember to look, listen, and smile, and share the trail, as both hikers and cyclists will be on it going in both directions. So far the experiment has been good. For our river preserves, Big Rock and Willoughby, the biggest challenge that we're facing there continues to be a rondo that was introduced during the big winter storms. We are currently recruiting volunteers for 2 big river cleanups that we're hosting in partnership with Ventura PD and Surfrider. So please visit our volunteer page to sign up for a shift. And lastly, Mariano Rancho is still on schedule to open to the public in 2025. And we are right now in our final 2 weeks of accepting suggestions for a name for the preserve. So if you have thoughts about what that preserve should ultimately be named, you can go to our website and you can submit up to 3 suggestions per individual. We'll be accepting those through the end of the month. Then our board will be reviewing those names, coming up with a short list, and then in December, you all will hear about the short list and get to weigh in again on what your favorites are. We'll be announcing the final decision for the name in February, right around BLT's birthday. All right, now on to tonight's program. In celebration of Oaktober, we are very excited. That's not my joke, I'll admit, I did make that up. We are very excited to welcome Rosie Daggett tonight to learn about her work with oak trees, including the threat of bad beetles. Rosie Daggett is the principal conservation biologist for the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains and certified arborist, and has been learning from oak trees for many years. Learning about oak trees and woodlands and their role in the local ecology has been one of her passions, resulting in her leading a variety of research and restoration projects. She led development of the Early Detection Rapid Response Plan for Los Angeles County, adopted in 2020, and previously coordinated the development and adoption of the Los Angeles County Oak Woodlands Conservation Management Plan in 2011. Although formally educated as a marine biologist, Rosie loves helping folks understand why fish need trees. Amen. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Rosie. Thank you, Rosie.
Good evening, everyone. We had to come appropriately dressed for October. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Alyssa Morgan, the Bad Beetle, aka. Alyssa has been the lead in charge of our oak restoration projects for about the past 3 years now, and is on the road to becoming a certified arborist and very much involved in all of the work that we're doing. So I'm happy to have Alyssa here tonight to help us talk about talking trees and bad beetles. So with that, we'll see if we can get this to work. I always like to start by thanking all the people who are responsible for me being able to have a story to tell you tonight. Because I get to tell this story, but the only reason I do is because we've had so much support from so many people for so many years. And what you're going to hear tonight is a synthesis of the research that we've been doing primarily in the Santa Monica Mountains, but incorporating things from a wide variety of areas. And all of that happens because people like you volunteer to help. And it doesn't happen without that. So it's nice to have all these funders, but really when it comes down to it, the boots on the ground and the eyes on the ground are the people in this room and others like you. And so I always like to start by thanking you for making the time to come tonight, and hopefully you'll learn something that you didn't know and be inspired to maybe help us with some of the projects that are going on. So, to start, why do we care so much about trees? Well, it's a really interesting thing because if you think about it, for many people, trees are like the background, right? They're part of our landscape, they're there, but you don't really pay much attention to them unless you're fighting for that spot in the parking lot that has the shade. And you want to park in the shade of that tree. But we often take our trees for granted. And one of the two messages that we want to convey to you tonight is that by paying a little more attention to our trees and not considering them just as, sort of background infrastructure, but actually looking at the potential we have with trees to really make a difference in terms of how the future of our area is going to be. And that's not an insignificant thing. So communication is sort of foundational. And when we think about how we communicate with trees, again, for most of us, it's, we like walking in their shade, we appreciate seeing a big, beautiful tree like that. We don't often take a little moment to think more about what does it mean to be able to communicate. It means that you have to have a sense of self. So one of the most fascinating facets of tree research in recent years has been to document that trees actually do have sense of self. They are able to identify as an individual. They are able to identify their closely related kin, and they are able to recognize other organisms. And when you think about it, that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, trees are there in their spot for 200 or 300 years. Just think how boring it would be if you weren't able to communicate with all the other organisms around you. But the other thing about communication is it implies connection. And this is another really fascinating area of research that's been happening in the past 10 years or so. Some of you folks like me might remember back in the 70s this very popular book called The Secret Life of Plants that recommended that if you plated Mozart to your tomato plants, they would grow better and stronger, all this stuff. Well, this set plant research back by decades because it was so, touchy-feely and really not necessarily supported by any facts at the time. But interestingly enough, some of those ideas were actually correct. And it's only been recently that we've been able to understand more how trees do communicate with each other. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's one of those things where you have to sort of shift your mindset a little bit and not think about trees as these passive objects. They're actually living organisms who have a very dynamic life. It just happens in a much slower tempo than what we're used to. So when you step back a little bit and you think about it, trees have been foundational to everyone on this planet for years and years and years, going back to the beginning of people. Because if they didn't have trees, they couldn't burn things and create fire. And it's always kind of interesting, people talk about the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. No one talks about the Wood Age, but every one of those tools needed a wood handle. And most of it came from oaks and yew trees. But trees have always been very highly connected to people, both in their distribution and as well as how well they've survived. Oops. So let's see if we can go back here. One more. So what's fascinating to me is when I started looking into this a little bit more, it turns out that the tree of life concept is found everywhere. There's like not a place, even in the northern countries, like when you go up into the high Arctic, where they're really, I mean, their idea of a tree is a willow that's like this big. Even there, tree of life is still a very important concept that's carried through all of the indigenous peoples. It was, of course, through Europe, we've always heard about the Druids and the Celts and how connected to trees they were. They had their own language, and the earliest written language that they found in Europe is called Ogham, and it's based, every symbol is tied to a specific tree species. So every sentence that you see integrates all the different trees that were important in that community. And then, of course, in the religious realm, we have, the Adam and Eve story, and we've got the Bodhi tree for Buddha, and you pick pretty much any religion, and there's still trees involved. And the reason I'm making this point is because trees have a lot to tell us and to teach us. And Tolkien had it right. The Ents do talk, they just do it very slowly. And we have to learn how to connect to that. So our local oak teachers, I know there's a lot of CNPS people here, so I don't probably need to tell you what kind of tree this is, but it's really interesting in Southern California. Our dominant oak tree is the coast live oak. And it's an evergreen tree. Interestingly, fun fact, every leaf lives for about 2 years, but they all are on different time frames. So that's why you always see a, mulch of dead leaves under the coast live oak tree. But unlike the valley oak, which is deciduous, these are just each individual leaf is doing its thing. These are also trees that produce acorns on a once-a-year basis. And what's fascinating is that our shrub oaks, which are also very numerous, also in our chaparral areas, the years that you get good acorn production in shrub oaks are different than the years you get good acorn production in coast live oaks and valley oaks. So it's as if the trees are sort of sharing the load of how do we produce when do we decide it's going to be a mast year, and how are we going to do that? Because it's a lot of resources to make that happen. And then, of course, the valley oak. We are at the southernmost range of the valley oaks. There are 17 oak species that are recognized in the state of California. Over 500 only found in the northern hemisphere, not in the southern hemisphere. And these valley oaks are considered to be one of our more endangered tree species in the state of California. And what's fascinating is the Portola expedition in 1769. They talk about leaving what was the area at University High School, which for those of you who are familiar with the west side of LA, it's the intersection of Bundy and Olympic Avenues. And there is a very important village site there where the Portola expedition stopped. And then they traveled up what is basically now the route of the 405, got to where the 101 intersects with the 405, hung a left, went west, and came all the way out to Oxnard without ever being out of the shade of an oak tree. Can you imagine? I mean, think about when we drive those routes today. They are just like, it's hard to even think about that. But the valley oaks were critical. And I think that one of the things that we should think about is these are long-lived species, and these individuals have all faced all kinds of different threats and impacts along the way. How do they do it, and what can we learn from that? So one of the things that I think trees can teach us is to pay attention to our sense of place and our personal geography. What makes your home your home? Why do you care about wherever it is that you live, and why is that special to you? And for trees, you know, it's the old saying, bloom where you're planted. They don't have much choice, right, in the matter. But once they do it, they do it with gusto. And they're really invested in making that place an important place for not only for them, but for others. And this goes back for thousands of years. Coast live oaks in particular have been, and shrub oaks, have both been ubiquitous in the Southern California landscape. And one of my favorite stories is that in about the mid-90s, there used to be a big department store that was on Wilshire Avenue in Beverly Hills. And when they excavated out the basement, because they were putting in a parking garage, they found a fully whole mammoth, woolly mammoth, complete, just buried. It was like part of the tar pits. And when they opened the stomach of that woolly mammoth, its last meal was acorns. So who knew that woolly mammoth needed acorns, you know? It's kind of interesting. And then of course we've got the ecosystem services, right? So wildfire protection, flooding protection, you know, holding our banks to keep them from eroding away, mitigating air pollution, mitigating temperature. And those are just the ones that you can put a monetary value on. And in a very conservative way, it comes out that about most mature, you know, an average mature oak tree can produce $35 or $39, depending on how you calculate it, worth of ecosystem services every year. So if you think about that there's probably somewhere around 600,000 oak trees in the Santa Monica Mountains, $39 per year, all that stuff that they're doing for us, if we lost that, we'd have to compensate and pay for that in other ways. It's really kind of a staggering amount, and that's a really conservative, because that doesn't even touch things like how beautiful they are and how much they are important in ecosystems. And I think that I just want to return back to this concept of home, because oak trees provide the home for literally thousands of other organisms that, if we don't have these oak trees, are going to disappear from the planet. And that's a kind of sobering thing to think about. So the distribution that we have of oak trees these days actually was started by the Native Americans, the Tongva and the Chumash in this area particularly, because they used oak trees for everything. And oak trees were such a fundamental part of their world that they took a lot of time and effort to figure out how to manage them to the best possible way. And so when the Europeans arrived and saw this whole pattern of distribution of oaks, they're like, oh, this is so natural and wild. Well, it had been managed for thousands of years because these guys really knew what they were doing. And one of the main reasons they did that was because acorns were an incredibly important source of food. And so making sure you had enough food was a very integral part and took a lot of time back in the day. So these trees were really a critical piece of the infrastructure for that community. And today, it's the same. Think about house prices, right? People who have oak trees on their property, those properties are 35 to 45% higher priced than their neighbor that doesn't have trees. And so they add all these values that we don't even always think about. Okay, so we talked a little bit about community. Now let's talk a little bit about collaboration. Because if you are a big oak tree and you're standing there for 200 years, kind of could get a little lonely. So being able to collaborate and work with your neighbors is an important thing. I am having trouble with this. So I don't think I have to beat the drum too hard around here with you guys, knowing how many different kinds of habitats oak trees produce. And the coast live oak in particular is not that particular about where it's going to be. Valley oaks always want to be where the soil is wet. Coast live oaks, you can find them everywhere, and one of my colleagues calls them the weed trees. They're not so much weed trees, they're just really good at what they do. And so they create all these different niches. And for the understory plants of oak trees, there's, I think it's like 1,200 different species that live only under oak trees in Southern California, and that's not even talking about other areas around. So they support literally thousands of other species. And I know everyone always kind of laughs at me when I show a picture of a steelhead trout, and why do oak trees matter to steelhead trout? But they do, because they are a pretty typical riparian tree. They stabilize the banks. Every 2 years, the leaf falls into the creek. It creates substrate for all the benthic macroinvertebrates that feed the trout at different stages. If you don't have oak trees, you don't have trout. And so it's a very tight connection. And grizzlies were one of the biggest consumers of acorns, and they and the scrub jays are considered to be some of the most important propagators of oak trees, because they would bury all their acorns in caches, and some of those trees would grow. So I don't want to forget the really important FBI, the fungi, bacteria, and insects that are important decomposers. And once again, oak trees host unique species that are not found on other trees. And so this whole web of life, if you think of oaks as like the hub of the wheel, all these other species, 5,000 species of insects, 150 species of birds, 60 species of mammals, 80 species of reptiles and amphibians, 5 species of fish, that's just in Southern California, need oak trees for some or all of their life cycle needs. So if we lose these trees, all of those other species have problems. I included this tree because I think it sort of is an example of how we often treat our trees. And how many times have you gone to the Thousand Oaks Mall and there's like one oak tree left, and it's surrounded by concrete, and they built all around it and all of this? They teach us persistence. And I think that one of the things that, as we face all these different climate threats that are coming our way, it's really hard to remember that persistence does pay off over time. So I'm going to start a little bit with acorns, and just to digress a bit, we talked about acorns as a food source for people. They were managed for that, but they're a food source for all kinds of organisms, but they're also the future. This is the future of our oak woodlands, are these acorns. And so when we get a good year, I was talking to Laura earlier that, when we get a good pulse of recruitment, taking care of those babies the best we can to ensure that they can continue to grow and thrive is a really critical thing. And since the early 1900s, we've really only documented about 5 to 6 pulses of recruitment. So most of the trees that we have in our forests, we're looking at an aging forest. And the recruitment patterns and the number of seedlings that we have, they are not as strong as they need to be. Grazing compacted soil, cattle ate the seedlings as they were coming up. So many reasons why we don't have a healthy mixed age stand of trees in all of our woodlands. So this gives us an opportunity. So if every one of you took 6 acorns and planted them, and we all did that, one of the calculations is that every person on the planet, there's what, 8 billion of us now, something like that, if we each planted 6 trees, we could stop the rise of carbon dioxide. because we'd start sequestering that much. Now, of course, I think that's a little bit exaggerated, but it does give you food for thought about how powerful it is to take that action of growing a tree. And these little seedlings, they spend most of their first couple years getting their roots going. And roots are the key for these oaks. And they can go for 50, 60, 100 feet and be the size of my arm. And they serve many purposes. First, they are stabilizing and holding the tree up. But also, more importantly, what they're doing is storing energy. That's where the starches and sugars that the tree produces in its leaves, this is where they go. And so when a wildfire comes and wipes out the entire canopy, which is, of course, all the leaves are what produce the food for the trees, it's all that stored energy that's in the roots that's able to push it back out and create more leaves. But more importantly than that, those root tips are what create the connections. And it turns out that root tips can learn, they can avoid threats, they can go different directions based on what they find. They're actually, if there was a brain in the tree, people think it would be in the root tips. And they're tiny. I mean, the root tips are literally like the size of your hair. They're really small, but there's so many of them and they go so far. And then they have this symbiotic relationship with the mycelium, which increases their absorption, and it's amazing what they can do. So they're sensitive to so many things and are able to give the tree all kinds of information. And that is one of the big ways they think trees talk to each other. But the other way, which is really fascinating, is through their leaves. So all the time, every day, whenever the tree is photosynthesizing, it is sending out tiny molecules that are either terpenes or they're phytoncides. And these molecules give messages to other trees. So the gypsy moth attack on one set of trees, a mile away, the trees are building up their defense chemicals. They haven't been touched by a moth, but they are reacting and being told, okay, problem coming, do something. So it's pretty impressive that they do it through the wind. But this was the one that I thought was most interesting. We don't often think of trees as being able to hear, but they can. And they, obviously, it would be helpful if you're, getting bitten by something to be able to differentiate whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Is this just the wind blowing through and moving your leaves and your branches, or is this something that's going to damage you? And so trees actually can hear, and that's a pretty fascinating thing. But that leaves us to what do trees talk about? And this is one of the new threats that our trees are experiencing, is these extreme heat events have become more frequent, they have longer duration, and they're occurring at different times of the year than they used to. Well, they didn't used to occur ever in May, and now we're getting them in May. And it looks like, actually, you can sort of see in this picture, it looks like someone took a blowtorch and just fried all the trees on the edge of the canopy. And when that happens, when the new leaves have just bud out, it's really devastating for the tree because they've just, all that energy they had just expended, poof, gone. And so they have to use more energy to put out more leaves and try to compensate for that. But this is the new thing that we're really not sure how this is going to play out. But I think it's one of the biggest threats we've got right now for our oak woodlands is how do we help them manage in these extreme heat events. But in addition to that, we have the bad beetles. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa.
Hi everyone. In honor of spooky season, I am a bad beetle. Very scary. So what does that mean when I say bad beetle? What is a bad beetle? Well, as we've discussed, trees have a lot of creatures that love them, including some parasitic ones. Trees do a pretty amazing job protecting themselves, whether that's through communication or protective instincts. Why are bad beetles specifically a problem? It's because a lot of the ones that are concerning are invasive. They didn't evolve in the same region that the tree's at. As a result, this tree doesn't have a defense mechanism, and potentially there's no natural predators for these pests. There's a number of invasive pests that are of concern, a number of invasive beetles, a number of native beetles. I'm going to focus on two today that are particularly concerning. The first one to start with is this handsome fella, the invasive shot-hole borer. That's quite a mouthful, so I'm just going to refer to it as ISHB. And as you can see from that photo, it makes it seem a little bit bigger than he is. So I actually have a few samples I'm going to pass around in these vials. And you'll notice that there are just these little tiny specks in there. And that is the ISHB. I believe that one has both a male and a female. So this leads us to the next question, which is, how can something so small cause such a devastating effect to these wondrous strong trees? And the answer to that for ISHB is actually pretty interesting. So what happens is the female beetle will find a nice new home, she'll land on a tree, and she'll bore into it. That creates these galleries. You can see examples of that in these two photos. In these galleries, she actually carries a unique fungus on the back of her neck. There are 3 different species of ISHB that are pretty indistinguishable visually from one another, but they carry different funguses. This fungus she brings with her, and she essentially fungus farms in the tree. Now the fungus eats the tree, and then she lays eggs through these galleries. And then the eggs hatch, and those eat the fungus. This happens over and over and over again, and you can have multiple generations of these ISHB beetles in a tree until you have thousands and thousands of those little pests in the tree. So you have both the mechanical damage to the tree from creating the galleries, and then you also have the damage of the fungus eating the tree. The tree does try to defend itself, and it does this by isolating channels that are infested, and that cuts off nutrient flow to those areas. This is something called Fusarium dieback. That works pretty well for certain regions, but with a bad enough infestation and it's cutting off enough nutrients to itself, it will eventually die. A bad infestation in a tree could kill it within 2 to 3 years of ISHB. So pretty serious for something so small to cause such a devastating impact. I'm going to go back for just a second. My other friend, which is who I am, a gold-spotted oak borer, I need my spots, is this one right here. And I also have an example, just one, that I'm going to pass around. And you can see not that much bigger than our ISHB friends. This one's a little more straightforward with the damage to the tree. Ooh, this is hard. And the gold-spotted oak borer I'm going to refer to as GSOB because it's also quite a mouthful. What GSOB does is it tunnels deep into the core of the tree and lays its eggs there, reproduces there, and then they eat the tree. This bottom right corner you can see, in this handful right here, this produced 186 GSOB beetles. That's an enormous amount, right? In just this little handful. GSOB is particular of concern as it really favors oaks. It's a picky eater, so it prefers coast live oak, the valley oak, and the canyon live oak. As you know, we have a lot of beautiful oak tree woodlands through this area, and GSOB was just confirmed not far from here, so this is a big concern. Got it. So once you have the infestation, there's a couple telltale signs, but they're actually very hard to identify. So I'll go over a few of them with you. The first one you have is staining. You've probably seen this if you've done some tree viewing, and this is some of this like dark kind of wet looking spots on a tree. That's an example of staining, and these are general responses to some sort of infestation. You also have what's called sugaring, which you can see right over here, which is this like kind of sugary looking substance outside the tree. You can have the production of frass, which looks just like sawdust. You can see that like in little bundles here, or it could be at the base of the tree. Those are all symptoms that maybe something is wrong with that tree, but to really determine what has infested it, the main indicator is going to be actually the exit hole. And that one is a really good example. You'll notice that there is a ballpoint pen in that photo. That is intentional, I have one here. And that's because ISHB, there are a lot of pest in trees, and ISHB makes an exit hole that is almost exactly the size, the tip of a ballpoint pen. So that's something that we really like to use in the field to determine whether or not we're looking at ISHB. GSOB is a little bit easier to identify. It leaves what's called a D-shaped ring as it leaves, which is a very distinct flat on one side and then round on the other exit hole. So those are some symptoms. How we really determine is just from the exit holes. We pretty much never see the beetle. That's pretty rare to see one. So what does this mean when you have enough trees dying? Well, unfortunately that means massive loss of woodlands. In fact, in 2004, San Diego determined they had GSOB there. By 2008, they had lost 21,500 trees. That's in 4 years, almost 22,000 trees gone from a single infestation, which is pretty scary, right? We all probably have our favorite tree or our favorite forest that you can think of right now. It would be really scary to think of that going. But it's not all doom and gloom. We have wonderful people working on this. So how can you help? What can you do? Well, there's a number of things. But the most important one, what I can't emphasize enough, is slow the spread. Slow the spread of the infestation. So tell your kids, tell your wives, tell your neighbors, go to your local trivia, steal the mic and tell everybody there. Don't move firewood. This is so important. We've probably all seen it. If you go camping, you'll drive into campground and they say only buy firewood locally. This is not because they're trying to make a profit off of it. That's because the #1 way that these pests move around is through us. GSOB, for example, is native to Arizona. We believe that the infestation that hit San Diego so hard was probably just one well-intentioned individual who was bringing firewood over. So it's really important that you tell and you know that moving firewood is very dangerous, especially when you see those vendors on the side of the road. It's quite possible that they're not certified, that they didn't treat the wood properly. So it's always important to make sure you know where you're getting your firewood. Even if it's infested, you want to make sure you're getting it locally so you're not spreading that infestation. And that goes for beyond firewood as well. Mulch, if you have a nice donation of mulch, you really want to make sure you know where it is, where it's coming from. A branch that's larger than 2 inches definitely could be a vector of these infestations. What else you can do is, if you're interested, if you're a nature hiker, if you enjoy the great outdoors or looking at trees, you could be a first responder, boots on the ground warrior that we so desperately need. This infestation takes a village, and so we are needing as many people looking around in your backyard where you love your trees to see if there's any signs of infestation. We have to know where it is in order to know how to treat it properly. So if you're interested in potentially learning how to identify these 2 pests, or if you're interested in learning how to report it, there's a number of resources for you. There's a couple of websites up here that I have, which UCANR is a really good one, and also you have the Ventura landtrust.org also has a lot of information about getting that training and learning how to report. I also have a number of handouts back there. Get involved, join our Citizen Science Watch, and help us stop these bad beetles so you don't see more of me. Thanks.
Sorry. So, what else can you do to help? You can help plant. And I can't emphasize enough that this is something that everyone can do, and it's really fun. And then you can take your children back in 10, 15 years and show them the trees that were planted as little acorns and what they'll become. We've figured out ways to prioritize planting locations because resources are really slim. But this is a key thing that you can do. And I know that Ventura Land Trust would love to have your help when they're doing their restoration work. The other thing that's really interesting is that we're working really hard in a regional way to make sure that we're prioritizing keeping our forests connected so that that also provides pathways and linkages for wildlife corridors. Everything from, the big mountain lions down to the smaller animals need these protected corridors. So having these oak woodlands there is pretty critical to that. So look around. There are plenty of places that you can go to help plant trees, and every single one of them will make a difference. The RCD, SMM, if you ever want to come out our way, we're a little far from here, but Alyssa's been running our oak restoration. We've got close to 500 baby trees that we are growing and tending and taking care of. So love to have your help with that. So just put this up here briefly. On the back table is a handout called Fun Facts About Oaks. And this bibliography is also in that, so you can have that. I just wanted to kind of point it out. These are some really interesting and fun books to read about oak trees. They'll give you more information than I did tonight, just sort of tempted you with all the different ideas that are going on. So we'd just like to say thank you for letting us share this information with you tonight. I hope that you are able to find a tree to make a friend. I made a friend many years ago with Grandmother Oak in Topanga State Park, and this children's book that we wrote about Grandmother Oak, all of the proceeds of it fund oak planting with the LA chapter of the CNPS, California Native Plant Society. So if you'd like to buy a book, they're $8, and happy to pass that on. Any questions? Yeah, back there.
Yeah, I noticed the return of the oak moth in my neighborhood, and about 5 years ago it decimated large swaths. It took out 2 trees, it took out a lot of oak trees within Midtown Ventura, and now I noticed the 2 Quercus in the area where I walk my dog are completely infested with oak moths. Is this something to be concerned about?
Yeah, but oak moths are actually one of the trees that co-evolved with the trees. And so they kind of do this boom and bust cycle. And they get bad for a while, and then they go away, and then they come back, and they're bad for a while. Yeah, so we don't worry too much about the oak moths and the filbert worms and filbert weevils, which also attack all the acorns. Twig girdlers are also another commonly observed oak pest. They're the ones that are responsible for leaving the little patchy branches, like little clusters of new growth that all of a sudden turn brown. And again, these are all co-evolved, so I wouldn't get too worried about that. The ones that are really devastating are like what Alyssa pointed out, the ones that the trees don't have any defense about. And so those are the ones that we worry about the most. Yeah.
You want me to use this? Given climate change, I'm sure you've thought about whether or not we should be planting the Quercus agrifolia, if we should be shifting to other kinds of oak trees. What are your thoughts on that?
So we've spent a lot of time thinking about that and what are the trees that are the most. But if you look around, what you can find are coast live oak and shrub oak that are growing in really hot conditions now. Like, they're doing fine. And so prioritizing collecting acorns from those trees and using those because they're already genetically doing fine with these hot temperatures. When we did the priority planting plan, we looked at what the worst case scenario for the IPCC climate plan projections. And we overlaid those with all of the temperature data that we have now and looked at where things might be good in terms of the range of tolerance of the trees. And what's really helpful to know is that coast live oaks are really pretty resilient. And so they're probably not going to be the ones that are suffering the most. The ones that'll suffer the most are the valley oaks. And that's, you know, as the groundwater tables shift and get lower, they just have a harder time getting the roots down to water. And they need that consistent water. So I think valley oaks are the ones I worry about the most in terms of our local oak species adapting to climate in the future. But the coast live oak and the shrub oaks, I think we're gonna be able to keep them going, which is critical because so many other creatures need them, you know, and our world would be so much less without all those. You had a question?
I do. I have two questions that are sort of opposite one another in the direction that they're going. One is that listening to lectures about forests and about forests recovering from wildfires and this kind of thing, one of the things that we are seeing is about forests that are left to recover themselves versus highly managed forests. Now I'm assuming this work is somewhere in the middle because the highly managed is the timber company level,
Right.
whereas you know the leaving it completely is doing nothing, and this is probably somewhere in the middle on scale. So one question is to address that. And then the other question is, when you do plant these saplings, what are the biggest threats to those saplings, and what kinds of things need you to do to protect them till they reach maturity and can go on their own?
So I'll talk a little bit about the wildfire response. So the great thing about particularly coast live oaks, but valley oaks and shrub too, is they've got a lot of stored energy in those roots. And they are fire evolved. They've been dealing with this forever. And so what's really cool is that they're able to, and I'm sure after the Thomas fire, you guys saw some of this, where then, you know, within a couple months, the trees start sprouting leaves, little tiny leaves. And they usually start in the center and then they work their way out from that to recover their canopy. Where things get problematic is when you have a wildfire and then several years of drought. Because that's like the 1-2 whammy that's really hard for the trees to recover from. And so, you know, that's where sometimes you just have to go in and plant more trees, because these older, more mature trees, they're just gonna struggle. And if you put in some new babies, they can start to fill in the gaps. So, and then I'm gonna turn the second half of your question over to you.
And the second half of your question was for planting trees, what
Threats to saplings.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. Predation is a really big threat. We actually tackle this by making little oak cages, which we just use 1-inch chicken wire and create a perimeter. We get a lot of deer, a lot of the ground squirrels will take them, so we actually even bend that cage in a little bit, and the trees are fine, their roots will grow through it, and that helps prevent them from being predated from the bottom. That's a big threat to them. Rosie always likes to say, which I love, is there's a difference between planting a tree and growing a tree. And as she was explaining, their first couple of years of life, they're a little more susceptible because they're still putting those roots down. After year 3, 4, they typically have a pretty strong root system. And so what we try and prioritize is potentially irrigation in the really hot months when they're not getting enough water, if it's a low rain year, just for the first couple years to get them established.
No, that's good. Yeah.
So let's pretend I want to raise some oaks.
Okay then.
Tell me what to do. I've got to just go out, grab a bunch of acorns and...
So, on that table are directions. There are directions on how to collect acorns, how to test whether they're viable or not. and some instructions on planting. So, yes, please
Would I
do.
grow them in a pot?
No.
Okay.
We try not to grow them in pots because there's a couple of issues with that. First is that while they do have an initial taproot, it quickly differentiates, and so they're going out early and fast. And when you go, like, I don't know if you've ever tried to dig up some of the volunteers that maybe show up in your garden. I mean, people are always saying to me, oh yeah, I've got like 50 volunteers in my backyard. Can't I just put them up in pots and they'll be good? Well, when you go to dig those volunteers out, even if they're like this tall and have 3 leaves, they have roots that are taller than me and that are going out, you know, some distance. So you lose a lot of the roots when you do that. And some make it, most don't. So putting in the acorns is the best.
And the study that we did.
Yeah.
We actually just submitted a paper on this where we studied the difference between planting oaks that had been grown in a local nursery versus acorns straight into the ground. And we actually discovered that those planted straight into the ground did just as well, if not better, than the ones grown in a local nursery, which also potentially may lead back to the trees communicating and helping one another.
Thank you.
I have a question for the bad bug. What happens when you come out of the exit hole? Do you die right away?
That's a great question, yeah. So it can vary, but a lot of times the gold-spotted oak borer, they can travel for up to a mile and go find another tree. They move between trees a little bit more. They typically will go to the next available oak. They don't typically skip oaks, and they'll infest that one. ISHB, they like to stay in their tree. It's generation of ISHB that's continuing to mate brothers and sisters within that tree. And they will exit to find, the females will exit and they will go find other trees. And a lot of times they'll die within, I think, the year actually.
Yeah. So we'll pass this around too. This was a sycamore that was infested by ISHB, and you can see here are the galleries that are that were made. But look at the number of holes. I mean, you can just look on the outside. So we'll pass it around as we're talking, and you can take a look at it. Yeah. So the ISHB. This is why the firewood issue is such a big one, because the beetles aren't going that far on their own. The Idlewild infestation with GSOB was traced to one firewood that was brought in, and Green Valley the same. So, and now we've got them right by the 5 on Easton Rice Canyon, and you know, we're terrified that they're gonna just come right over the Santa Susana area and right into the Santa Monica Mountains and then whoosh, right across, you know. So, yeah.
So how close to us are any of these? You just mentioned along the 5.
So GSOB is actually not that close to you yet. We took out infested ISHB trees in Ojai. So ISHB is in Ventura County now. It's not extensive in Ventura County now. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that the photo that Alyssa showed of the sugaring, that's on an avocado. And so you guys have a lot of avocados. And in fact, the reason we first know about ISHB is because the avocados were hit first. And the avocado growers were the ones who funded the first research on ISHB.
That should bring a lot of resources.
It did initially, does not now. But one of the other things that's sort of important to note is that these trees are not totally defenseless. And so what we are finding is that there are some trees that are able to like resist. And we don't really know yet why one tree can do it and another can't. But one of the really fascinating studies was down at the University of California at Irvine. That campus was planted with sycamores all at the exact same time, right, when they built the campus and they did the first landscaping. And ISHB hit that campus really hard. But there were like 10 trees out of the whole campus that were surrounded by trees that were dying of ISHB, and they were fine. And so part of the research that's going on is, what have these trees got that we need to give to everybody else, you know? And so they're, you know, the trees do mount defenses, but it's a question of timing, right? Because trees don't do anything on a fast time zone. And so, you know, they really don't. And so giving them a chance to respond to a new threat, eventually they will, but not immediately. So in the short term, what we want to do is try to keep the forest going as much as we can, right? And then give the trees a chance to figure it all out. So you had a question?
Thank you. First, it's not my question, but commenting on this planting in Culver City, right? I work with trees. I'm a landscaper, and one of the things that I'm observing in some of the gardens, and I'm having so much trouble with many trees, is that there are pockets. For example, in a property, I have pockets of boron. So some trees are being decimated, and the same trees, you know, sometimes a huge hedge of Prunus caroliniana, you know, some of them are collapsing after 6 months, and the other ones are fine.
Right.
But I had two questions. At the beginning of the presentation, there was something saying that oak trees help with mitigation of fires. I was in the Woolsey fires, and I observed that some of the trees were untouched, or you know, they lost the leaves, but they have this beautiful regeneration coming back after the fabulous rain we had. And some of them, they were absolutely, you know, burned. So what is
the difference? So you brought up two issues. The issue first is soils. So soils do make a difference,
right?
And that's sort of a crapshoot, particularly when you're in an urban area where you're trying to plant in someone's yard or in a facility, and that's just you know, making good use of the soil lab that's over in Santa Paula, which I send samples to all the time. But in terms of wildfire response, it's really interesting to see. What oak trees do is that thick evergreen canopy catches the embers. And so the embers come and lodge in the canopy of the oak. Oaks are hard to ignite, but once they get going, they burn pretty well. So what's being done is looking at how the placement of trees in relation to where the prevailing wind is coming, so like where the Santa Ana is bringing the wind and the embers, if you have lines of oak trees there, they catch those embers before they get into other areas to ignite. And so the severity of the burn for the tree varies depending on how much it's caught, right?
Right.
So,
and sometimes in larger properties, I've watched that, you know, it's a lot of placement really.
Exactly.
Some
And so
oak were
fine and some not.
untouched,
Yeah. So it's a really interesting thing to look at. We're just doing a study with the University of Colorado looking at modeling the ember movement for the Woolsey fire, actually, and is what's being used as the example because we have all the great wind data for that, and we know where the houses were impacted, and we know where the trees are. so that stay tuned. We don't have the results of that modeling yet.
Right.
But in general, oaks are a pretty good plant to have as a wildfire resilient and resistant kind of
In
plant.
terms of the beetles, is there any biological control that, because you know I use biological control and I start having problems with eucalyptus, for example,
The
when
red
there's
lips,
no
yeah.
biological control pest for that particular beetle.
Yeah, that's a great question. As of right now, no. There's not a good biological control. Even treatment right now is very complicated. You're looking at removal of amplifier trees in really extreme circumstances. There's some treatment options, but it gets really complicated. It doesn't always work. You're looking at using pretty heavy pesticides that you inject into the tree, which you can't do in a lot of areas if it's near a water table. So the treatment is a little complicated. As far as biological controls, there's nothing that we've found.
So, so the USDA folks have actually gone to Vietnam, which is where the ISHB is native. And they have been looking, University of California at Riverside is doing all of the biological control research. But, you know, it's one of those things where be careful what you wish for, because you never know. Unintended consequences can happen. So they're being very, very careful about what they're doing with that. But that is an area they're looking at. So.
And in terms of protecting them and preventing, because you spoke a little bit about irrigation, what I've been thinking about particularly.
But they really like moist trees.
Say it again?
They like trees that are moist as opposed to trees that are dry. So the trees that are in our landscapes are actually more at risk than the trees that are in our wildlands that are not getting the irrigation.
Something's cool that actually I just learned recently is for GSOB, they are currently breeding oaks that are GSOB resilient. Obviously, we don't know exactly the mechanism, but essentially finding ones that are more resilient to it, and then in nurseries, they're trying to breed them specifically. A big part of the conversation is an area that's already been hit really heavy, potentially by GSOB. They tend to favor the larger trees, and then the question is, well, if you go in and reforest there, do they come back? And so a big part of the potential solution is planting these trees that might be a little more resilient. So potentially that would be a good solution for more urban interfaces too. Yeah. And then
Thank you.
Also got a great question over here that was, do the bad beetles favor only live trees, or are they at risk for dead trees as well? And typically they will, if they're moving for an infestation, they will go to a live tree, but if you have fallen wood that's been dead for over a year, they still can be very live and present as an infestation in that wood.
So I wanted to mention, it was really striking, you mentioned there were only 4 or 6 cohorts in the last 120 years.
The pulses, yeah.
And that also corresponds with fire suppression in California. So back in the Stone Age, when I was studying botany, we were just starting to learn about the role of fire in the chaparral. And it plays a very important role actually in regeneration. So is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, so I personally have not looked at that, but but you're right, it does play a role. What's interesting in these pulses in the Santa Monicas in particular is that they happened when you had 1 or 2 good rain years followed by an okay rain year. So if you have a couple good rain years and an okay one, the babies are able to get themselves sufficiently well established that they can survive the fluctuations that we have in terms of how much precipitation we get in a year. But the other confounding and interesting issues were cattle grazing, land management basically. Where were we cutting down the trees? Where were we grazing cattle? And cattle grazing, it had huge impact on recruitment because the hooves of the cows compacts the soil. So the only example I have is at what was the Amundsen Ranch, that's out off the 101 near Valley Circle Boulevard, that area, Las Virgenes Road. That was heavily grazed until they took the cows off in 1980. And it wasn't until the late 90s, after we had 3 consecutive good rain years, that there was any recruitment. So it took that long for the ground squirrels, the erosion, the wind to do enough of a loosening of the soil. The other confounding issue is invasive ruderal herbaceous plants, are these non-native grasses They just suck up the water so fast, and then they die, and that's okay for them. But when you have an oak tree that's trying to persist over time, that's a real kick in the teeth for them, because they just can't compete. They can't outcompete that. All right, one last fun fact. How much water moves through an oak tree in a day?
A lot.
Anybody have a guess? What do you want to guess? So 240 gallons per tree per day. And what's really cool about that is think about our pattern of rainfall. You know, the trees that are out there today haven't had rain since, May. And they're still circulating this amount of water. And they are recycling it, and there's this whole feedback loop that they have where they're recapturing and reusing all that water. Such a cool thing,
Sorry, one more question. How much gets transpired? I mean, how much is lost during that?
So that's another really interesting thing. All that outer canopy, next time you're near an oak tree, go pick a leaf on the edge of the canopy where it gets full sun. Then go into the interior and the shady part and pick a leaf and look at that and look at the difference. So what happens is the tree basically shuts down all the photosynthesis on the outer leaves that are getting full sun, the stoma close. And the only photosynthesis is happening in that dappled shade, interior, protected, more humid environment of the interior of the canopy of the tree. And so that's how they survive and still manage to put, money in the bank, so to speak, of starches and sugars in their roots during times when it's just so stressful. So you had a question, I'm sorry.
If a person plants an oak tree, how often do you water it?
So, I'll let you talk about
Great question. Also, something that Rosie, going back to your question real quick, I think you say a thimbleful, like a thimble of water is what they can lose in a day, potentially on a really hot day, is that right?
Yeah.
And then how often to water, that can really vary. So if you're getting a lot of rain, you don't need to water at all. But in the really, really hot seasons, we've discovered, and it's pretty hot where we're planting too. I want to say this year, we definitely had a number of days we're in the triple digits, and we water twice a month, and we try and give them about 5 gallons of water, and we've discovered that that works. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into it. It really depends on the soil. We're really good at building a berm. We try and always plant in the drip line so they can get in the shade of a mother tree. That's really, really important. As well as we use oak mulch that helps prevent the desiccation. But just that 5 gallons twice a month in the really hot months seems to have a pretty high success rate.
So I just want to add one other thing. Mulch is magic. Not mulch from ISHB infected trees. I do want to be clear about that. But in general, mulch is magic. At the Valley Circle interchange of the 101, they moved some massive oak trees back in the 90s. And we were able to measure the soil temperature at the surface was like 120 degrees. Wow. Under the mulch, it was 75. Wow. And oak roots, and most tree roots for that matter, once you get above 85, they are not happy campers. So that 3-inch layer of mulch made the difference between 125 and 75. Yeah. Well, thanks guys, lots of questions.
So for the folks who might still have the vials with the Beetles samples, we want to make sure that they end up back over here with Alyssa. Oh, okay, but they're in the back of the room. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Rosie and Alyssa, for sharing your work with us tonight. This was absolutely fascinating. And thank you for your work in research and restoration. You're truly making our world a better place. So thank you for that. As we near the end of our event, those of you who have been here before, you know I got a few words to share with you before we call it a night. Ventura Land Trust was founded almost 22 years ago as the Ventura Hillsides Conservancy, and its mission is to protect the land, water, wildlife, and scenic beauty of the Ventura region for the benefit of current and future generations. This is a big promise that we are making to those who are here today and those who are yet to come. And we can only fulfill that promise with your help. There are so many ways that you can do that by providing your time, treasure, and talent. You can volunteer, you can sponsor, you can donate, you can become a member. You can share us and our work with your family and friends. You can advocate for VLT and for nature and for open space. If you'd like to learn more about ways that you can support VLT, please connect with me or any of our staff members who are here tonight, including Dom, right over here, and including Laura in the back of the room. And in the meantime, we do hope to see you at one of our upcoming events. This is the final Environmental Speaker Series event of 2024. Please be sure to follow us on social media and join our mailing list to receive updates on the 2025 series. We'll be announcing hopefully some information about that soon. Please, let's thank Rosie and Alyssa again for a we also want to make sure that we thank Channel Islands National Park for hosting us and our partner SoCal Edison for sponsoring this series. On behalf of my colleagues at VLT, our Board of Trustees, I would like to thank you for attending, for being such a great audience, and for supporting Ventura Land Trust. Together, we are building a legacy, one that will continue to provide impact for the people and the wildlife of the Ventura region forever. That's a big word, and it's a promise not taken lightly. Thank you for your partnership in this effort. Be well, everyone, and have a good night.